Not all protest is created equal. That's one of the lessons of Parshat Korach. Now, we have a long and proud tradition of protesting against injustice, speaking truth to power, even when that power is God. Like our first Jew, Abraham, who argues with God that it's wrong to kill all the innocents along with the guilty in Sodom and Gomorrah. Or Moses, who's not afraid to take on the powerful Pharaoh. And in the modern era, Jewish leadership in the fight for civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and more. Protesting is important and effective and encouraged by our tradition. And these protests follow the model of our ancestors Hillel and Shammai, two famous, constantly debating rabbis who disagreed about just about everything, but did it in the name and pursuit of justice and truth. In Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of Our Fathers, a section of the Mishnah, it says, "Every debate that is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. Every debate that is not for the sake of heaven will not endure." What debate was for the sake of heaven? The debates of Hillel and Shammai. It was arguments for the sake of heaven because they modeled how to listen to the other side, how to hear the minority view, and to keep truth as their goal. But Pirkei Avot doesn't end there. It says, what kind of debate was not for the sake of heaven? They say, the debate of Korach and his community. So in this week's Torah portion, when Korach rises up against Moses and Aaron, it becomes the model for the argument that is not for the sake of heaven. It is for the sake of hell. Literally, listen. Ostensibly, Korach frames it as a fight for democracy. He says, all of us are holy. Why should you put yourselves above us? He says to Moses and Aaron. But in fact, his language is just a cover for a power grab on his part. Vayikach Korach, the very text begins, and Korach grabbed. The text describes this wasn't for the people. He was grabbing it for himself. And God saw right through it. And we know this because God opens up the earth, and Korach and all his followers are swallowed up alive and sent down to Sheol. Sheol is one of the Jewish words for hell. Now, our text makes very clear that Korach's protest was not in service of a higher truth or more just leadership, but just about division, disruption, and a selfish power. It's hard not to see parallels regarding the conflicts in Israel recently with these two different kinds of protest. We saw this last Saturday the 24th consecutive week of peaceful protests in Israel against proposed judicial reforms and other issues that the Israeli government is proposing. Tens of thousands of Israelis have continued to come out to protest what they see as radical reforms that threaten the very democracy and foundation of their society. People who have visited Israel and attended the protests, including our own Rabbi Salth just last week, have come back inspired, saying that the protests feel like a fight for the sake of heaven. But this week we also saw a very different kind of conflict and protest in Israel. We saw deadly violence from Hamas terrorists who killed 4 Israeli citizens with gunfire. And then, in vengeance and protest, hundreds of Israeli settlers stormed the town of Turmas Aya, setting fire to cars and homes, smashing property, injuring many, and killing a Palestinian resident. Additional soldiers were deployed into the West Bank, but they did very little to stop the settlers' destruction. Now, acts of vigilante justice from these extremist settlers is not new, but under this government, which is the most right-wing in Israeli history, rather than censure, some have even publicly supported it. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich's response to similar settler violence just a few months ago in Huwara was, Huwara needs to be erased. Netanyahu's response to the most recent killings was to pledge to build 1,000 more units of settlement housing. anyone who cares about Israel, who calls themselves a Zionist, as I do, must condemn this violence and the continued unilateral settlement construction in the strongest terms. These actions are not about establishing more security or more peace in the land. This is not a conflict for the sake of heaven. This is an opportunistic grab for more land and more power. It's a conflict that brings all of Israel into Sheol. So what can we do aside from protest here from afar? Well, we can support all of those who are building a civil society and stronger democracy in Israel. I'm very fortunate to be a member of the advisory board of the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act Fund, the MEPA Fund, which gives $250 million administered by USAID for people-to-people peace-building initiatives between Israelis and Palestinians. I traveled with this advisory committee last February to see the first 10 grantee projects paid for with your taxpayer dollars. We saw Project Rosanna, which trains nurses from 4 different Palestinian hospitals and 4 Israeli hospitals together, sharing best practices, doing research together, learning each other's languages so they can serve the other populations better. This healthcare diplomacy, as they call it, puts the shared goals of saving lives, healing people first. And then, of course, there is the added benefit that it brings people from different communities into proximity with each other, learning each other's stories, empathizing. We visited Eco-Peace Middle East, and there I met a climate activist who was not originally going at it from a peace-building perspective. This Israeli said, I didn't go into this to work with Palestinians. I'm a climate activist. But one day, I went to observe the Jordan, which is a river that is sacred to 3 different religions, but right now is little more than a sewage dump. And I saw that the river, as it comes through the West Bank and into Israel, doesn't care about the Green Line or any borders. We are all interconnected, and we cannot do this work alone. This climate diplomacy has brought Palestinians and Israelis together in common cause. And I saw tech diplomacy and shared business enterprises. And in every single case, people who had come from 2 different sides of the border, who had never often been in contact before with anyone from the other side, were making unusual alliances in service of shared goals and realizing they had to build a shared future. Now, the former UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process is on our advisory board, and he did not have a lot of optimism for how the current government would resolve the conflict. So I asked him, are all these projects we're funding with this MEPA fund, are they just window dressing? Are they just making us feel better, but they're just too small that we can't possibly do this on our own? And he asserted that this bridge building work, this civil society work, this strengthening of democracy was more important than ever. He said we should be doubling down, tripling down on this work. He noted that de-escalation is not just about withholding military operations. He said the long game for de-escalation work is learning each other's stories, building community, rejecting the status quo as inevitable. He confirmed that this work that we were doing, people to people, on the ground, between communities, was in the sake of heaven. We each can do our own part. I will soon leave for Israel myself, where alongside Rabbis Elliot Cosgrove and Chaim Steinmetz, we are bringing a dozen Manhattan Christian clergy to Israel on a pilgrimage of curiosity, empathy, and righteous protest. And closer to home, tonight we are also fortunate to have 4 Israeli leaders from IGI, which is the largest Israeli LGBTQ youth organization. They are here with us and will be speaking to us after services. So even tonight, you have the opportunity to support the work of democracy and civil rights in Israel. We can either be upset and frustrated. We can be upset and frustrated even as we are proud and engaged with the state of Israel. Now is not the time to pull out, but to protest harder for the Israel that we want to see and build and support. And this truly will be a protest for the sake of heaven.